Let me introduce myself. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Mexico Center here at Rice University's Baker Institute. I want to welcome you to this event, reflection on Mexico's telecommunications reform. As you know, this past summer, Mexico passed an important and rather progressive telecom reform. Houston being Houston, the energy reform that passed in August has taken all the attention in the media and in the Houston various business communities. However, telecom reform is just as important. It is one of 11 reforms, structural reforms, that Mexico has passed over the last 2.5 years. The first was in August under still then President Calderon on labor reform, and then education reform and fiscal reform, and a series of other reforms to continue with telecom reform and energy reform this past summer. Today it is our duty, our job, to reflect on what telecom reform means in Mexico. So I want to welcome you to the Mexico Center. The Mexico Center is a 2-year-old enterprise here at the Baker Institute. It is a point of reference in Texas for Mexican affairs and for binational affairs. It is an effort that was led by Erika de la Garza of the Baker Institute and myself over the last 2 years, and we have now established a strong reference point for Mexico and binational affairs here in Houston. I will cede the microphones to our moderator of the day, but I want to introduce him first to this event, Unbundling Mexico's Telecommunications Sector, Reform, Investment, and Digital Democracy. Our moderator is Alfredo Corchado, a friend and a well-known journalist. He is the Mexico Bureau Chief for the Dallas Morning News and an expert on immigration, drug violence, and foreign policy between Mexico and the United States. He has reported on issues ranging from the disappearance of women in Juarez to the exodus of Mexico's middle class to the United States. Over the years, Corchado has exposed government corruption and the reach of Mexican drug traffickers into U.S. communities. He has described the perils of journalists that face the results of Mexico's wave of violence and an increasingly silent press in Mexico. Corchado has reported from Mexico, the United States, and Cuba, and has lived on both sides of the border. In fact, I met him this past summer in Mexico City at a coffee shop for another academic project. He was a 2009 Nieman Fellow at Harvard, a 2010 Rockefeller Fellow, and a scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Corchado won the Maria Moores Cabot Award of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism in 2007 for extraordinary bravery and enterprise. In 2010, he was awarded Colby College's Elijah Parrish Lovejoy's Award for courageous journalism. He is a 1984 graduate of the El Paso Community College and a 1987 graduate of the University of Texas at El Paso. Let me ask you to please welcome our moderator of the day, Alfredo Corchado.
Thank you very much, Tony, and it's great to be at the Mexico Center here at the Baker Institute. I was talking to some colleagues last week in El Paso. I was visiting El Paso, and many of them expressed remorse that Tony is no longer there. We miss you, Tony. Houston's gain is El Paso's loss. As Tony said, I guess the rules are that I have to remind you that it's being transmitted live on the webcast. So we will, everything's is on the record. The reforms has enormous potential for Mexico's telecom industry and for its political future. The jockeying has already begun. Last Friday, Texas-based AT&T agreed to buy Usacell, one of Mexico's biggest cell phone service providers, for $2.5 billion, including debt, as it seeks to expand its international presence by moving south of the border. as a reporter, I'm just going to ask a lot of questions, and hopefully at some point somebody will answer them. I guess my question is, will AT&T finally make something out of this after it failed so miserably in the 1990s? President Peña Nieto has said telecom reform is one of several, including energy, aimed at making Mexico much more competitive, increase wealth distribution, and transforming the country into a more just and equal nation. The devil, however, is in the details. Several questions remain. Will President Peña Nieto's so-called Mexico moment, a carefully crafted narrative of economic reforms, the growing middle class, and opportunities for investors, bridge the divide with the other contrasting narrative of an unjust Mexico, a Mexico where poverty and inequality have played key roles in more than 100,000 people being killed or disappear, including the most recent horrific example of 43 students in the state of Guerrero? Specifically, will telecom reform lead to increased competition and lower cell phone and internet prices for consumers? The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, reported in 2012 that Mexico's costs for mobile phone usage were five times the average of other countries. Peña Nieto's reform would eliminate long-distance rates, and calls within Mexico would be considered local. Do the reforms go far enough in breaking up the monopolies? The last time we had big reforms was when Mexico privatized Telmex, and the result was the creation of the richest man in the world, Carlos Slim. Additionally, the TV market is split between two mass media companies, Televisa and Azteca. Between them, they control 94% of commercial TV frequencies. Radio is and has long been concentrated. 80% of commercial stations are in the hands of only 13 groups. Internet access is dominated by either Slim's Telmex or local cable competitors that are often Televisa units. And then there's democracy. The great journalist from Texas, Bill Moyers, once said, "Democracy and journalism are intertwined." Indeed, telecommunications have the power to impact countries' economic and social development, and they're essential in the development and strengthening of democracy, access to culture, education, health, and the full exercise of human rights. The reforms reinforce the government's role in making sure smaller voices are not drowned out by power, money, or bias, which is too often the case today by the control of powerful monopolies. It all looks good on paper, but again, the devil is in the details. Hopefully this afternoon, we'll get some answers by our four stellar panelists who will try to help us leave this room with much more insight. We'll spend 15 minutes with each panelist, and we'll start with the great Clara Luz Alvarez, who is a non-resident at the Mexico Center, the scholar at the Baker Institute at Rice University. She's also a member of the Mexican National Research System at the Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas of the Mexican National Autonomous University, or UNAM. Clara will focus her talk and a presentation on the legal framework of the telecommunications reform and its impact on digital democracy. Clara. Aquí o allá, como quieras.
Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you with one of the views regarding this telecommunication reform in Mexico. I would like to start just to put our context, where we are now in Mexico and why we are here. So in last century, Mexico was constructed on top of monopolies and on top of oligopolies. So this construction assured that the political system had the loyalty of the enterprises. So the economic groups will have this loyalty to the government because they receive licenses, they receive concessions, and so on. That assured that they will be loyal to the government. This was back in the time where democracy was still down the road. Now we're still constructing democracy. I don't have to say that we are facing very strong challenges in democracy, but at least we're not back in last century. So telecommunications sector was not the only one that was constructed on top of monopolies. We have this monopoly that, as Alfredo was telling, it gave the creation of the richest, or one of the richest men in the world, of Carlos Slim. And this country, let me see, I wanted to put some figures on. Okay, the good thing is that I'm in telecommunication, but I'm not a techie. Okay, who controls what? So let's see where we are. We have fixed telephony. 67% is owned by América Móvil. América Móvil is the holding company of Carlos Slim's group. We have fixed data, 66.9%, América Móvil. Mobile telephony, 70.1%, América Móvil. Mobile data and internet, 62%, América Móvil. Pay TV, 53.7%, Televisa. And free-to-air television, we have 70% as an average share of the audience. And these are official figures from the Mexican regulator. So now you see that we have a problem. When you have so few enterprises controlling telecommunications, it has a deep incidence in democracy. So what we saw, and these are my conclusions after leaving this process of enacting this new telecom legislation, is that first of all, this was not a law enacted in favor of public interest. We could have a long discussion of how this law was enacted to protect certain interests of big corporate groups, or to see how some corporate groups fight against the other ones. Public interest, society, we were on the backstage and they never took us in account, as I will try to argument in this presentation. There's in the US, there was a very prestigious judge that he said that where there's no remedy, there's no right. Well, in Mexico, we have new rights without remedies. And this is like a tradition in Mexico. They love to put all the rights on the Constitution everywhere. We sign every human rights treaty that there's in the world. Mexico will be there. Complying with that human right, well, that's another issue. But we have there now, as Venezuela or as Ecuador, we have a new right, and it's supposed that the Mexican government is in charge of assuring that all the people that live in the Mexican Republic, we have access to information and communication technologies, telecommunications, internet broadcasts, and so on, so on. There's no remedy for that, but we have that constitutional right, and perhaps that's going to give rise to lawsuits in order to enforce that right. We don't know the outcome, but we have that right. So there's no remedy. For the first time ever, if we could just point out that in Mexico, the media groups were very much aligned with the government view in last century, when one political party ruled for the major part of that century. And the politicians still see, because of the influence that TV has on Mexicans to decide on their political lives, to get informed for news, because in Mexico we're not generally used to reading a lot of newspapers or confronting information. For the first time ever, the Constitution refers that we have rights as an audience. If we see television, listen to the radio, we have rights. So that's a good thing. There's a big catalog in the new law that says that you cannot discriminate, that you cannot incite to violence, and so on, so on. The only issue here is that there's no remedy before an authority. So there's the creation of, let's say, ombudsperson. That's the ombudsperson will receive all the complaints from the audience to see whether the content transmitted violates or not violates the audience rights. But that's a particular person, it's not an authority. So it's if we saw this from a human rights perspective, there's no access to justice, because justice, according to human rights treaties, must be done, and the remedy must be before a competent authority, not from a particular person, even if it's the most respectful people in our society. And there are no sanctions. So even if let's say at 3 p.m. on the public channel, they're portraying violence and blood all over, as they do, and that's an audience for children, and it's supposed to be protected, or even if they are infringing the privacy rights of the people, nothing happens, because the law does not have not even $1 of a sanction. So that, seen from an institutional perspective, is very bad, because even if we think that people will act in good faith, that they will comply with the law and with the laws of a country, there must be an authority to say you violated the law, and if you violated the law, then those are the consequences. Well, this law doesn't have anything about audience rights. What's the consequences of having more advertisement in broadcasting? So this is a big issue in Mexico now that they have a strategy against overweight, because we have a big population with diabetes, and they have evidence that having a lot of advertisement with fast food, with high-calorie food, and all this has a direct impact in the behavior of people. Well, this law doesn't do anything with high-calorie things, but they establish that the broadcasters are allowed to transmit 18% of their time of transmission per day in advertisement. The consequence of that is that they could have in prime time 50% per hour, but from midnight to 6 a.m. they will have zero advertisement and nothing happens. They will be complying with the law. They also exclude from the definition of advertisement the offer of products. That means advertisements that are more than 5 minutes are not included in the maximum of advertisement. And also, they could increase that with national production, that the law defines national production of audiovisual content at those that has financing, Mexican financing. But in other countries, what they do with national production, they say it must be, let's say in Colombia, it must be Colombian persons that make this content. It must be made with artists that are, the majority of the artists are Colombians, and it must be done from Colombian things. Well, in Mexico, nothing like that. They could do a production in China with a Chinese company, with Chinese artists, with Chinese culture, and that, as long as it has Mexican financing, it will be included in this national production that makes it possible that the broadcaster increase 2% more of the advertisement. National independent production also can increase 5% more of the 18%. And it's the product placement that is a figure that you can be, let's say, in a soap opera that's very, very popular in Mexico, and we can start drinking, let's say, a Starbucks coffee or whatever, and that's product placement. So that's allowed by the law. The law says you can commercialize spaces within your programming. That's no problem. In Mexico, they don't see anything. And there are a lot of studies that they say that people receiving a TV program, when they see the advertisement, they're alert, because they know that that advertisement pretends to make the necessity to buy the product. But when you're looking at your program, your TV series, whatever, you have your self-defense against advertisement is lower down. And then you're more susceptible to receive that message, not because you're considering it as an advertisement, but you're naturally receiving that. There was a big discrimination, and that's one of the major things that impacts democracy in Mexico, because one of the remedies against concentration, absence of plurality, absence of different points of view in media, is having social media or public media that could give another vision different from the commercial broadcasters. Well, they didn't justify why, but if a commercial or private licensee could have a term of 20 years in the case of social media, as could be an indigenous community or the community of South Houston or whatever, if it's a community, then it could be up to 15 years. No reason why they discriminated or differentiated. In case of the income, even if the Organization of American States has referred to the necessity of these social media being able to receive income to support their productions and their infrastructure, here it's prohibited to have income for advertisement. There's even a Mexican Supreme Court ruling saying that they can receive income for advertisement, but that was not considered by the legislators. So social media can receive income only by governments and limited to certain part. And also they included, instead of having the certainty for the public and the social media, they say that at least they have to comply with certain requirements. These had been also declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but nothing happened. They included this at least, which gives the possibility that they require more information for them. But that's not all. If you're a community or you're an indigenous people that request one community radio, you can only receive it on the upper part of the FM band or in the extended AM. And I don't want to get very technical. But the issue is that if you receive those type of station, the coverage is limited or you cannot receive with so much call quality. So it was a discrimination directed to communities and to indigenous people. Must carry, must suffer. I say that it's the Chipotle version. So you have must carry, must suffer from long time ago. And must carry worldwide, that it's the obligation of pay TV to carry the signals of open broadcasters. That's the must carry. Worldwide, it has been justified to retain localism, to have diversity and plurality. That's in the US, in Canada, in the European Union. Also, it's considered a burden for pay TV because they have to include within their programming the local TV stations, or radio station could also be. And the must offer obligation, that is the obligation of the TV broadcasters to give the content to the pay TV, that's complementary, it's not a big issue. Case of Mexico. The purpose is competition. The purpose of the must carry apparently is to foster competition because the main broadcaster, that is Televisa, the channels 2 and 5, and TV Azteca, the other commercial, they have another 2 channels. Those are these deployed worldwide, and they assume that any pay TV in Mexico must have these channels to succeed. And plurality, where's plurality? Do we still have in Mexico the idea to have Televisa have more power in the minds of the people? Because everything that's transmitted through TV has an impact on the minds of the people. Televisa is plurality? I don't think so, as you can see. And must offer becomes the most important thing. How can we get that content of Televisa? We need it. And well, that's the Mexican Chipotle version of the must carry, must offer that is totally contrary to the reasons why in other countries they had it. So as final remarks, I would say telecommunication reform, was the legislative process a democratic one or an autocratic one? The answer is autocratic. But we don't have time to speak about it, but I could send you information of how this process was made. The media role, specifically the commercial companies, only highlighted that there's not going to be any more long-distance charges, but they never addressed all the impacts to the audience rights, the increase of advertisement, the discrimination for social media, etc. What was this telecommunication reform pretending? Did it sought public interest or pursued public interest? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? In my opinion, definitely the losers was society and the quality of democracy that could have changed if this reform had addressed conveniently in favor of public interest. And I thank you very much for your time. And those are my contact details. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara Luz. What a way to temper enthusiasm, no? Next, I want to introduce Eli Noam. He's director of the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation at Columbia University, and he will walk us through the economic impact of the reform.
Thank you very much. Actually, I will not walk you through the economics of the reform. I will walk you through something else, namely, how does Mexico stack up internationally? Because it's one thing to say there's a lot of concentration, and Clara kind of did a really wonderful job in showing us these numbers, but it's still another thing to say kind of it's exceptional, it's unusual, it's too much, or something along these lines. And so this is what I'm going to do. But thank you very much first for the invitation. Colombia and Rice are closely allied because we've been swapping presidents. We got George Rupp and you got David Lebron, and so we're kind of, obviously it's kind of nice to be here and check out in person that this trade has been going on well. So I'm a professor of finance and economics, and although I have also a law degree, I will not deal with the legal regulatory reform issues, but rather with the basic issue that we are trying to deal with. And I will do some international comparison. Why international comparison? Because when we compare internationally and do it right, we can differentiate between broad trends and market structures that exist around the world. And those are things that are very difficult to change, those kind of trends, because they're fundamental. And dealing with them by governments is a bit like King Canute trying to deal with the tide. As opposed to differentiating between country-specific problems that might be more susceptible, therefore, be more susceptible to some regulatory action. And so I will try to do that. So I will report on the results of a 30-country study that we've done, led by us at Columbia with teams in 29 other countries, and those teams in turn consisted of 60, 70 or so professors and other researchers. And so we have a very good database, and we have tried to put some kind of a standardization on it so we can compare apples to apples, et cetera. So, let me see how I move this forward. Okay, so we looked at 13 different industries, and that is more than telecommunications, so broadly defined, includes also internet and visual media and so on. So let's see what we find. We're using a kind of multiple measures for concentration, including this particular popular one called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, which is a square, the sum of the squares of the market shares. Don't need to kind of know the details, but when I talk about market shares, often this will be based on that. And so we kind of try to see what is happening around the world. And so let me just ask you the question, who is the largest media owner in the world?
AT&T.
All right, anybody, any other takers?
Murdoch.
Murdoch?
I would say American Movie.
For what?
American Movie.
American Movie. Well, here's actually who the largest owner is. Okay, by far and far. It's a big country, and the government pretty much owns everything when it comes to media. Now, kind of let's say, okay, that's a government. What about private media? And if I repeat the same question to you, is it still Murdoch? Is it still Carlos Slim? Not quite. It's actually those kind of funds, financial institutions, institutional owners. They own 10 billion here and 5 here and 7 billion here. If you add it all up, it's much larger than of the individual owners. Now, it's not controlling ownership, so if you look into that, then you get into the direct personal owners, then you get into Carlos Slim, much larger than even the Google boys and Cox and Armstrong and Moan, and Rupert Murdoch is actually only number 33. I mean, he has influence, sure, but in rich countries, which gets us to kind of one important observation. The focus of media researchers when it comes to media ownership has been on first world type countries. And they don't look so Murdoch has been kind of a bit of a bête noire, partly because of the politics of his media. But in actually dollar terms, as opposed to influence terms, it is much smaller. Now, if we look into that, then, if we look into that, nothing's moving.
The arrows in the keyboard might also.
Okay, so we can also kind of take a look at news attention. That is kind of when you look at the time people spend for news, not entertainment, and kind of weigh this by number of eyeballs or eardrums or whatever, then we find that, again, that by far the largest is the government of China. I'm not going to go through this table here, but kind of rather to point out that kind of Grupo Televisa is actually in world terms, although Globo in Brazil is still larger, but Televisa is right up there. It's the 8th largest worldwide, and it's the 4th largest worldwide among private companies. So we're not just talking big in Mexican terms, we're talking about big in international terms. It is larger in news attention than any US company except for Rupert Murdoch's companies. It is larger in terms of news attention than any European media firm. Now, the players that exist around, we've also already heard, Carlos Slim, richest man in the world, richest man obviously then also in Mexico, and the market shares Clara has already presented, so I'm going to just gallop through it. Televisa, that is Emilio Azcárraga, and also market shares that are astonishingly high, except that they used to be even higher. And then Salinas of TV Azteca, together, as Clara pointed out, over 90%. And also to be mentioned, because it's really part of the media environment in Mexico, is this man and this company, which might not get quite the same attention worldwide as the others, but here look at the newspapers that this company controls. All these are different newspapers, and in terms of market share of newspapers, it's almost 60% of the newspapers, which is just an astonishing percentage. And now, okay, so now let's kind of see how we can compare this internationally. Let me, because for reasons of time, just kind of do this quick, and so I'll skip this one here. Let's just look at, no, I'm sorry. Okay, content media. Content media as opposed to platform media, which is telecom and wireless and wireline and ISPs. So content media, you will see Mexico very close on the left, very close to the top, and the top is being represented by such more kind of government-oriented type countries, the China and Egypt and Russia and so on. Those are all the way, but pretty much right after that comes Mexico when it comes to content media concentration. If I look at platform media, you also see Mexico very strongly over there at the left side, following Egypt and Turkey and South Africa and China. And those are all countries, except for Turkey, with a very strong governmental role in platforms. If we go to, let's skip a lot of stuff here. Now, when one shows something like that, then people normally will say the following. They will say, yeah, but Mexico, or whatever the country is, it's different, it's larger, it's smaller, it's richer, it's poorer, whatever. You can't compare them. So what we've done is we've tried to look at all kinds of factors, such as size, such as wealth, such as education, et cetera, years as a democracy, and kind of factor them in some econometric study. Take those factors, factor them in, and then look at the unexplained difference. In other words, we're already adjusting for size, we're already adjusting for poverty, and so on. And if we do that, then you will see here that when it comes to newspapers, Mexico is up there, and it's kind of significantly high up there, meaning kind of the straight line would be the line which can be explained by these various other factors. Anything above it, why is this happening? So there's China all the way up there, and there's Australia, Rupert Murdoch, and Belgium, which is a weird case in every respect, and then there's Mexico. But it's not that there's something natural about this, because when you look at magazines, you see that Mexico is fairly much explainable. Whatever the market shares, the market concentration is in magazines can be explained by these various factors. When it comes to TV broadcasting, Mexico is not quite as high up as one would have expected, but still significantly above the line. But countries such as Italy, Silvio Berlusconi, France, Vivendi, clearly have a much larger market share. India has a very strong governmental sector. In Ireland, I don't know what the factors are for Ireland. And when it comes to wireless, Mexico is second highest, second only to China in unexplained very kind of concentration. In wireline, similarly quite high, and ISPs kind of high. And so those are factors that have to be taken into account. Okay, so Mexico is an outlier. It's not just kind of, yeah, sure, we are poorer than the United States, so what do you expect? No, that is already taken into account here. Now, some other things to show. The number of media voices in a country, voice defined as a media company, magazines, newspapers, book publishers, TV stations, etc., but content-oriented media companies in the news. And when you see that Mexico, in absolute terms, has some of the smallest number of media voices, in absolute terms. When it comes, and the United States has the highest. Nice, but much less nice if you look at it on a per capita basis. Now the United States actually is one of the worst performers because it's got a large population, so whatever the number of voices are, divide them by 320 or so million people, we kind of drop down to a territory that's close to India and China and Brazil and Mexico. All right, but strongly performing in terms of diversity, pluralism per capita are small countries with a relatively healthy democracy. Ireland, Israel, Switzerland, Finland, Sweden, Portugal. Those are countries where there's a lot of media relative to the population. Now, I'm going to skip all this. Some factors that could increase and do increase in some countries media pluralism is a state role, which is usually public service television, BBC type style, or ARD or ZDF type television. And here, if we look at the prevalence of public ownership, we see that Mexico, together with many other Western Hemisphere countries, have a very low participation of the public sector in the media environment. On the one hand, that's kind of good, no government. On the other hand, when it comes to an actually open, pluralistic public service television system, that just doesn't exist in the Western Hemisphere outside of Canada. Now, the almost last issue here would be foreign ownership. Foreign ownership, although it obviously has this element of kind of colonialism, neocolonialism, and so on, nevertheless is also a factor for increasing media participation. In the United States, for example, with the internet, we get BBC more, we get the Guardian, and we get foreign media more. And so this is a pluralistic enhancing role. And here, so if we look at foreign ownership of media, here too, kind of Mexico is relatively, well, it's kind of more at the center of things. The United States is much lower when it comes to content media, partly because there are restrictions. When it comes to news media, though, Mexico is by far the least foreign presence in the news media, much smaller than, say, Brazil, other Latin American countries, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. And now let's see here. Okay, high export media. Now here's something that has to be said that is positive, which is Mexico, through América Móvil, through Carlos Slim, is also in global presence, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, that is out of proportion with its economic and other size. So you can see here that América Móvil has, of major media companies in the world, a very high percentage on the right side, export percentage of 77.1%. Only Vodafone, of large companies, only Vodafone, Pearson, and Google are higher. Google is partly because of their accounting manipulations, and they've been shifting their profits into Ireland, and so there's a lot of kind of accounting kind of footwork, fancy footwork going on here. But with América Móvil and the other two, that is clearly foreign activity that is going on. And so América Móvil is an export success for Mexico, and presumably that is a factor. In consequence, Mexico is, as a share of global media exports, Mexico has 8%, which is kind of quite high, relative to its share in the world media market, which is only 1.1%. In other words, Mexico is by far an overperformer in international media activities. And if you see, the United States is actually an underperformer in the sense that its exports are lower than its domestic share in overall global markets. Okay, so last issue here is, what about the internet? Many people believe, yeah, sure, media concentration exists, but it's temporary, it's legacy because it's legacy media. The problem will be solved because now we've got the internet, right? Right? Wrong. Because actually, when you look at internet media, you will see that they are actually more concentrated than offline media. Online media are more concentrated than offline media. Yes, in the beginning of something new, there's a lot of kind of entry and competition, and it's wild and Wild West, and that works nice. But after a while, things stabilize, and then you have Google with 80-90%, you have Facebook with 80-90%, you got YouTube, you got all kinds of other things where the market share is not only very high, but it's globally very high. So one of the things that we found was that market concentration, now this is global, this is not Mexico, market concentration is pretty much a function of capital intensity, that the more capital intensive a medium is, the more concentrated it is. And since online media, internet media, electronic media are more capital intensive than, say, traditional journalistic intensive press, print, and so on, those are more concentrated media. So you can have small newspapers, but you don't have small search engines, all right? And so therefore, as the world's media are moving towards a, let's say, online presence, they will become more concentrated. And therefore, the internet is not going to be a solution to the problem. The internet will become part of the problem. Okay, similarly, globalization. Globalization seems, at first blush, to increase pluralism, and to some extent it does, but it also leads to very large integrated worldwide media companies that operate everywhere. And so, to conclude, therefore, what we can see is kind of very high market concentrations in Mexico, above what you would expect in international comparison. A trend that to the future is actually going to lead to more concentration. That's a kind of global trend. That's not Mexico specific, but the absence of a technology solution to the problem. And therefore, If we perceive that to be a problem, and I do think it is a problem, then a policy approach has to be chosen rather than hope for a technology solution, which brings us back to our friends in Mexico and how they're going to handle this. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Next, we have Edward Knightley, who's the chair of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Rice University. Edward.
Thank you very much. So as an electrical engineer in the wireless networking area, I'll talk more about the technology and the underlying wireless spectrum issue. And so I'll start with a worldwide view and what's new and what's exciting, and then end with the role of these trends in Mexico. Let's see, so spectrum. So if you don't know anything about spectrum, then one of the most exciting things in spectrum happened in 1985, and this was when the FCC allowed usage of ISM bands. So ISM stands for Industrial, Scientific, and Medical bands. So everything used for Wi-Fi all uses those ISM bands. When those bands were released in 1985, they were considered the junk bands of spectrum. It was the spectrum nobody wanted, because if it's spectrum useful for cooking things in your microwave oven, then maybe it's not the best spectrum for communication. And that's true. It's not the best spectrum. It's actually the worst. But nonetheless, instead of just opening up a market for cordless phones and baby monitors and so on, it opened up the markets for Wi-Fi, and estimates are on the order of 10 billion annual. It's very hard and depends what you count as part of the Wi-Fi markets. But it's generated a huge economic boom worldwide. Prior to 2010, there were really two flavors of spectrum. Licensed and unlicensed. So license is exclusive use. That's with AT&T as an example. There would be an auction. They bid on spectrum at an auction. They get a license for exclusive use. Nobody else may use that spectrum. They purchased it. Unlicensed is the category that I just mentioned for Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi is unlicensed spectrum, but there are still some ground rules. And the ground rules, for example, limit the maximum power. And one reason is so that other users, your neighbors and so on, can also share that same spectrum. Now, since 2010, there are some emerging new models of how to allocate spectrum. And so there can be not only a primary spectrum holder or unlicensed, but there can also be secondary users, meaning those that give priority to some other entity. So a little bit about UHF bands. So UHF, the acronym is a little unfortunate. It stands for ultra high frequency, but that was an acronym given in the 1950s when it was considered high. Now it's considered low frequency. But UHF are TV bands that you use with those same rabbit ears I'm picturing, and those are bands from 470 to 700 megahertz. In the 1950s, they were allocated to television. It's considered the beachfront of spectrum. It's some of the best spectrum out there below a gigahertz because it has the best range, and it also has the ability to penetrate walls and trees and other objects. So you probably have experience in Wi-Fi in your home where you might get the signal through one wall, but by the second wall, you probably need a repeater to keep it going. So these bands do much better with distance and with walls. So a major ruling, really the biggest ruling out of the FCC since 1985. There really wasn't much action in terms of spectrum policy, in my opinion, until 2010. So this came out very recently. And it said that if we have an unused TV channel, meaning that, for example, if there's no channel 50 right here in Houston where we're sitting, then we can repurpose that spectrum and use it much like an unlicensed user would. And so this is enabled by the switch from analog to digital TV that the UHF bands were mostly filled, but now digital is more efficient with its spectrum usage, so now there's more availability. And the incumbents are still there. The incumbents are the TV broadcasters, and they still are the primary users of that spectrum, and they're protected. They're protected by making sure that devices don't interfere with TV, and also a database lookup to see whether spectrum is available. So this is a big change that you can dynamically check whether there are any available channels in your physical location. So in the US, a number of spectrum databases have been authorized by the FCC. Google has one, Spectrum Bridge has one. You can try it, showmywhitespace.com, and you'll see, just type in your zip code, your house, you'll find out how much UHF spectrum is available right there. So spectrum sharing at 3.5 gigahertz is also another big change in the US and globally as well. And so 3.5 gigahertz now, so we moved from megahertz up to gigahertz. And the basic idea here was to take spectrum that was very underutilized by, typically by military for radar systems, but very low utilization, typically only on select coastal areas, and to repurpose it and to make it available for broadband. And so the spectrum sharing technique, again, uses this spectrum database idea. So it's a real-time query of, can I get the spectrum right now? Is it available? And can I get permission to use it? So this is a very new model, right? Back in 1950, it was channel 50 belongs to this spectrum owner, and they have it for the next 50 years. So now it's dynamic, and spectrum can be allocated and reallocated on minutes time scale. And so there's 3 tiers now with this model, that there's federal or whoever the incumbent is. There's a priority access licensee, so the carriers can bid to build out a service in an area and have priority access. And then the third category is a very important one, that whenever there is no spectrum used in a particular area, that it can be used by anyone, general authorized access. So this is really important, makes spectrum much more efficient, because whenever it's unused somewhere, it can be reclaimed. The carriers are actually against Category 3, just like the television industry was against the white space ruling. The carriers don't want this third category. They want more exclusive allocation. So the future, so UHF is the best spectrum, but it's all being allocated to TV. 10% of the population in the US watches TV exclusively over UHF wireless. It's a very small percentage of the population, extremely wasteful use of those great resources. So there's going to be a reverse auction to try to get the UHF carriers to give up their spectrum, and that'll be a big battle in the US. It was supposed to happen this past summer. It keeps getting delayed. But it'll pitch the TV spectrum owners versus the carriers versus the unlicensed advocates versus all the special interests. The second thing is real-world experiences and advances with spectrum sharing. So the technology, we've done research trials in Houston for a number of years, and we're continuing to do research trials. So this is a technology just really in its infancy. Another is highly directional bands, the very high frequency bands. That's another important research area where at very high frequency bands we can get gigabit per second speeds, and right now this is an open question for how that will be regulated. Globally, the battle over spectrum has a tremendous impact in broadband access. That what will the quality be, what will the services be, and how affordable will it be? So whether it's spectrum sharing, whether it's a licensed, unlicensed, have a tremendous impact on what those services will be. So I'll end with one slide on Mexico and focus my comments on the sub-gigahertz band, this beachfront band. And so there are a few things to comment on. So one is 700 to 800 megahertz is allocated to LTE, or the next generation of cellular data. And in particular, the Asia-Pacific model of allocating spectrum. So versus the US model. And a model of virtual mobile operator, so that with a common spectral range that multiple providers can utilize that same spectrum. In the TV bands, after the switch to digital TV, Mexico will have more UHF available spectrum than the U.S. does. So the U.S. has a love for TV and many channels, as you all probably realize from your own personal TV usage, and that costs us a lot in spectrum. So if you look at, for example, 600 to 700 megahertz, what's happening there? Well, if you, in Houston, go to check how much UHF channels are available, meaning unused by TV, there's nothing. TV uses it all. Every channel, 1 through 55, are all used. There's nothing left in 600 to 700. We actually have one channel available around 500 megahertz. In contrast, Mexico City will have 48 megahertz available after the switch to digital TV. So to put that number in perspective, depending on how what type of technology is used, that number 50 megahertz could multiply by 2 or 10 to get a bandwidth. So how fast can you go? So you could view that as that 50 megahertz, rounding off, would be about 500 megabits per second. So Mexico City could take that 48 megahertz and build a 500 megabit per second wireless network using it. It would be astoundingly fast. Tijuana and Juarez will have 60 megahertz. A long-term plan for Mexico will free up even more in the 600 to 700 range by pushing remaining channels 38 to 51 down to lower frequency bands. So that's going to free up a lot of spectrum in the 600 to 700 megahertz range. So there's a lot of chance to do something different. There is more spectrum available in UHF, and it's a question for Mexico as to what will the spectrum model be? Will it be auction it all off to the carriers, leave some unlicensed, or some mix of these new dynamic spectrum sharing models? And with that, I'll thank you very much.
And finally, we have Juan Jose Latlo, who is the former Chief of Staff and Director of Regulatory Policy, Comisión Federal de Telecomunicaciones, and former Director of Systems at Telmex. Maybe you can tell us how this will change the competition, and where's the devil in the details? What's change?
Well, I certainly want to thank the Baker Institute for inviting me. I am no academician. I am an entrepreneur, practical man. So don't expect from me fancy graphs and things. However, I would like to thank Edward for ending up in such a positive message. What he said is true. Mexico is positioned in an extraordinary situation for mobile broadband going forward. It's extraordinary. We already have more high-quality spectrum than the United States, and we will have a lot more coming down the line. And that's because of a brave political decision that we took while I was at the COFETEL. We decided not to follow the US model for the 700 band plan. That was a political shock. It was a political nightmare, but we dealt with it and we stuck by it. And people are saying that that should change because it was a bad decision. It cannot change because fortunately we wrote it in the Constitution. It is written in the Constitution that 90 megahertz of the 700 band will be used for a wireless mobile wholesale network. If somebody wants to change that, they need to change the Mexican Constitution, and you can tell me when that will happen. It will not happen. So we took bold stand regarding that, and thank you, Edward, for reminding all of us that Mexico indeed took steps that will create an environment for competition that has never seen before in the world. Because the problems that the US are more complicated than Europe, but even Mexico will be in better position than Europe regarding spectrum. I must say, it's the nice side effect of TV monopoly. Sorry, but it was. So many years with the Televisa monopoly, so few channels being put out, the spectrum is free for broadband. So it's a positive unintended consequence of the TV monopoly, that now we have a spectrum to create competition. So I do believe that in the long term, Professor Noah says that internet will not by itself, the way it is regulated now, will bring competition in media. But I think now that we know the problem, I think we will find ways to regulate that. And what Mexico is doing in the wholesale network may be a hint about things to come in that term. The move of allocating the 700 band for a wholesale only carrier of carriers network was a bold move that has been widely criticized. It has been criticized because it's something new and incumbents don't like it, and regular operators don't like it. Vertically integrated mobile operators don't like it. It's against their DNA. They want to control the whole supply chain from your device to the applications that you use. That's what they want. Of course, they are losing that battle step by step. Let me give you a parallel so you think how it makes sense what Mexico is doing with the wholesale. Imagine that your electric company had the monopoly or the right to instruct you which dishwasher you buy. That's the size of the ridiculous situation in the telecom business today. And what radio you buy and what TV why? Because it's plugged to the electricity. It's ridiculous. So this vertical integration that came for historical reasons has to be broken. And it will be broken once we understand that telecom is a utility, just like the electric utility, just like the water utility. It's like, they say how I use the water in my house. No, I do whatever I want with the water or with the electricity. So once you break that, that is possible because of standardization. Now we have internet protocols, we have LTE protocols, we have Ethernet plugs. So 20 years ago, it was a problem because it was not clear what was the technological direction the world will take. But now it's all over global standards. And global standards evolve step by step in a very well globally orchestrated way that gives a lot of stability to the production of goods and equipment and all of that. So given that we have commoditization of the interfaces, then the separation of wholesale and retail makes enormous sense. Now, Mexico will have the prime 700 spectrum available for a wholesale network that the government will issue a bid in the next coming months for anybody to go and try to earn the bid, the privilege of building and deploying that network and operate it in a wholesale fashion. Mexico will become absolutely the mecca of over-the-top services, the mecca of MVNOs, the mecca of everybody that wants to provide service will have to come. And we can come with no barrier of entry. No barrier of entry for offering services, no barrier of entry for... Why? Because the carrier has the incentive to sell capacity, not the disincentive to keep his integrated operation going. So I am no researcher, but I am sure that the decisions that the Mexican government took, political decisions, of opening this network and putting it available for several, will give a lot of topic for research and will open up a whole new cases of business models. And let me tell you, the good news is that the reform is already working. Being in Texas, I have to honor my friends of AT&T, but I don't know, but for me, it's better to have AT&T than to have Mr. Salinas. I mean, Salinas sells and AT&T buys because of the reform. Has to do with that. People were saying, you were asking if it was a failure, AT&T in the 90s. Let's see if they can make it up this time. I think they will. Let me tell you why. When they came into Mexico in 1990, they came under the illusion or promise that they would have access to ducts and fiber of the incumbent. Okay? But you know what? They didn't. So they had absolutely a huge barrier of entry that not even AT&T at the time could pass in order to create competition in Mexico. They were denied access to ducts, poles, and fiber by the incumbent, while they thought they would have access. So it became a nightmare very fast. They entered long-distance competition, which they were immediately priced overcut, and everybody lost except the incumbent. Because the regulatory and legal framework under which they entered was designed for that to happen. So it was a success from the regulatory point of view. We had the regulatory design to create a monopoly. We definitely did it. Well, the entry now is based on a constitutional reform that makes access to infrastructure, competition, absolute mandate. There is no question about that. We can have questions about the secondary law here and there, not too many regarding this topic, fortunately. But certainly, for competition, the entry of AT&T is proof those guys don't move their dollars just like that if they have not analyzed that they will be able to compete. And they will be able to compete because they will have access to the USSL spectrum. I think they need more spectrum than that. We shall see what happens. But they will certainly benefit from the wholesale capacity that will be available in the 700 band. So AT&T, like the rest, is looking forward to use that capacity to compete against the market. So in a nutshell, I think the decisions that Mexico has taken, thanks to a political pact that was done between the opposition and the government a couple of years ago, the biggest reform ever was put forth. Fortunately, there were a lot of ideas already floating about how to execute that reform. There was a famous study done by the OECD that some of you may know about that laid out many of these ideas. But there was political will to do the change. The constitutional change was done in agreement by all the parties, and now we have a completely new environment in Mexico for competition, which I believe is going to be successful. I certainly hope that being here in an academic institution, you can devote resources to study what was done there. We had to do it because it was a matter of life and death. Either we free the telecommunications or the country will continue to be poor forever. We are convinced of that. Let me tell you, justice is a motivation for this project, and it's written in the Constitution. When we began analyzing this thing many, many years ago, we discovered that the Mexican regulatory model had produced a situation where a Mexican poor will pay 10 times more for a minute than a poor in India. I talk to academics and say, no, India is a disaster, there is too much competition. 10 times cheaper, give me a break. So what we did is say there must be a middle ground. We cannot have a spectrum chopped up into many infrastructure carriers that produces low returns, may produce competition, but will produce failed companies. So we had to find a way in the middle. And the way in the middle is allocate the spectrum for a carrier that has the incentive to sell, incentive to all commerce, and leave the rest of the operators, which will get concentration, Telcel and whoever, use their own spectrum to compete, and use that same spectrum to compete. So it's not rosy, but there is a road ahead that we can pursue, and certainly the analysis that can be done by institutions like yours will give us guidance, because now we are a bit lost. We put on the table all these changes. Now we need to transverse them. We need people thinking of how we can adjust one way or the other so that this thing is successful. Thank you very much.
We have about 10, 15 minutes, and I was reminded that if you want to ask a question, please identify yourself so that the people watching can identify you. Questions?
Jimmy Dunn. I think that most of the technical talk, I think, was above our heads, but I think the important thing is competition and freedom of speech and freedom of the press.
There you go.
You should not have any media controlled by the government. It should be open to private companies, individuals to have good news programs. I think Mexico needs a lot of education, I believe, right? Literacy and all that, so you need to stress education down there and more competition and freedom of the press.
What's the question?
How do you get there?
How do you get there? It sounded like we're talking about the same issue with different visions. I'm wondering, how do you measure success, Clara Luz?
I would point out that because Juan and myself, we come from Mexico, and he's very positive, and I was pretty critic to it. But I have to tell you that it's because this law is so broad that one part is the bad one, the one regarding freedom of expression, right of information, having a plurality of voices over the media. That was not addressed on the law, and it won't change the scenery of Mexico and Mexican democracy. So it was, in my opinion, a waste opportunity. On the other hand is the part that Juan was telling, that perhaps there would be good opportunities for deploying a good network that will enable Mexicans all over Mexico to get connected to the information. And as you pointed out regarding the literacy, we have a big challenge regarding media literacy. We have a big challenge in literacy by itself. But then, when you have a population that even myself, that I'm a researcher in these types of things, and I realize that I'm not a media literate, because they can abuse of what they say on the media, and I can do nothing about it, or I cannot confront different points of view. Well, obviously I use the internet, and then I can have another vision. But the ordinary Mexican, the ordinary citizen, will take for granted what the TV says. And that imposes a big challenge on constructing a real democracy. And in my opinion, this law does not overcome these already legacy challenges for our democracy.
Juan, you want to respond to that? I mean, how do you measure success?
Yeah, let me say, I am sick of optimism. I am an optimist guy. And what Professor Noah said to me is a key issue. How can we ensure that internet openness produces democratic openness? What I'm sure is that the reverse doesn't happen. Expensive, unavailable internet cannot push democracy. So one has to put an objective in life to be happy. My objective in life was cheap internet. We will get cheap internet in Mexico with the best spectrum, with the best possible conditions. That leaves to some other generation and somebody else to solve the other problem. But I'm sure it's going to be a lot more simpler to solve with that access than without that access. So it's a problem for you to research, but yes, I think the problem will be solved by somebody else.
Eli, Professor Noah?
I obviously have been critical of the situation in Mexico, but I think it's kind of useful to put this also in perspective before we pat ourselves too much on the back here on the other side of the border. The regulatory compact, constitutional compact that the parties in Mexico passed as constitutional amendments just a year or so ago?
12,
yeah,
May of 2000.
Okay, it was actually quite extraordinary in comparison to the gridlock that we have. The quality of the people appointed to the regulatory commission in Mexico is quite extraordinary relative to the quality that we have in Washington. So things are moving, things are changing, and they are far from moving. I mean, there's backtracking, the secondary laws and so on that were instituted. But we should also take a look at ourselves and see how pluralistic a media structure we are creating and what the challenges are. By looking at Mexico, we should also look at ourselves.
Yes, question over here, and then we'll go to the middle.
Sunny Lim from Rice University. What, from each one of your standpoint viewpoints, what is it that Mexico can do to make themselves competitive in the international landscape? Because it's no longer good enough just to be good in your own country, but you have to compete overseas. And I was just driven to the statistic that you had, Professor Noam, about how the concentration in Mexico is lower, but the export of its content is higher. And I think that usually is in the category of my wife's liking for the various soap operas. So what is it that Mexico can do in this deregulation to make themselves a competitive world landscape player, not just in Mexico, but across? It could be standards of democracy, it could be the use of bandwidth, frankly. So it could be technological, entrepreneurial, or sociological.
Maybe one comment to start on the spectrum side is that you know it's generally a pretty safe bet for countries to say their regulatory bodies will copy what the FCC did. But I think that there's an opportunity to do something different, and seeing a big chunk of spectrum at 600 megahertz, I think is a great example. I think it's a question to really do something innovative. It would take a national scale commitment to say that we're going to, for example, leave a big chunk of spectrum unlicensed. No other countries in the world are doing that. So that sort of innovation would change the spectrum landscape, would bring in the Qualcomms and Intels to make the chips and make things less expensive. So I think through regulatory commitment and national commitment, there really is a chance for technical leadership from Mexico.
Yes.
First, the export intensity of Mexico is almost exclusively that of the wireless company, the Slim company, basically. It was not the content. The content was there too, but in a small way. I think Mexico has a presence in, let's say, telecom and television, more kind of traditional media. I call wireless already a traditional medium, rather than the applications and the content and kind of new types of content. I think there Mexico is not on the world map in a strong way as it should be. And so the question really then becomes one of technology, high technology development. That is an issue that also European countries are facing, and so on, as kind of manufacturing is shifting to Asia, and as in some ways the most interesting software stuff is in California. There really isn't very much left for Europe to be present, and so Mexico has the same problem. I think the kind of a key thing would be several education, engineering education, enormous expansion of the engineering education. Secondly, probably some form of investment incentives that would bring in companies, and I think Huawei is kind of moving to Mexico in a strong way, and so that companies would come to Mexico to manufacture perhaps at first, but then also to expand this into the software applications.
Yeah. My grandmother always taught me never insult your host. That's why I have been very careful about talking with the FCC. But since you have all touched it, when we were looking at a model, we certainly didn't look towards the FCC. We look more France and England and other places. Because you need the regulatory independence from Congress is very important. Because Congress is a political animal by definition, and here FCC is called the child of Congress. That's why you have the hodgepodge situations that you have somewhere between broadcasters and all the history. So we didn't want that to be. So certainly there are just few points in which Congress can still put its hands, but they will be removed through the judicial process. Now, going back to innovation, I think removing the barrier of entry for innovation in telecom is going to be revolutionary in Mexico, I believe. Let me tell you why. When you have a vertical integrated operator that control the spectrum and the access to the spectrum, anything that you want to do, you have to ask permission to the operator. And if you don't have power to negotiate with the operator like Apple has here, you are lost. So by removing the vertical integration of the operator, anybody that wants to do anything with the spectrum just has to raise his hand, get a permit, register for a virtual mobile operator, and do whatever he wants as long as the device is homologated. So if anybody wants to come play with 100 megabit mobile stuff in Mexico, you're welcome. That's what's going to happen. So we are removing the brutal barrier of entry for innovation.
I think we have time for one more question or two quick questions. Start in the middle and then back.
I'm Ford Frost. My question is somewhere in what you gentlemen were talking about. There's so much spectrum available, but at a certain point in a certain population density, Mexico, will you run out of spectrum, not having a hardwired spine to put that into? Does that get to be a problem at some point, or is this something so totally new that few people in the world who say the Japans or whatever, they come up with all this kind of stuff, will they be catering to your market because it's so unusual, or will this be a problem ultimately? What's y'all's opinion about that?
And then can we go to the last question and answer?
Yes, of course. Josefina Cortez from Mexico. I really would like to read the reform in a very positive way, as well as mine, but I would like to ask you about the relationship between structural reforms and rule of law. Because maybe we are talking about the reform in a very abstractive way, but we have a premise before this kind of reform. That's the question. What about rule of law in Mexico?
Okay.
Even in a positive way.
Start with final or
Yeah, I can answer. I love the rule of law question. Sorry, I think it's Mexico. The rule of law is asymmetric. Okay, if you are the richest man in the world, you always win the injunctions because the court immediately responds to you. That's the way it works. You're a poor guy, you don't get that treatment. Now, what happened with the reform, at least in my concern, is that the monopoly of rule of law by the incumbent got lost. They will not win all the trials now, because the Constitution is in favor of the people. So that's going to create a good move forward. Now, there are many other problems. In my sector, in the telecom sector, the legal process will now be a much more balanced process towards the benefit of the people, as opposed as it was before. So I believe that with this respect, the reform is an absolute success, and there are already proof. They have been losing injunction after injunction to try to block the application of the reform.
Clara Luz.
Well, the rule of law, in my opinion, does not exist in Mexico. End of the point. Why? Because if we assume that a country treats differently depending if you have power or if you have money, then there's no rule of law. The laws, human rights, the Constitution itself have been enacted in order to protect the minorities, the defenseless, not the rich one, not the economic power. But at the end of the day, all these supports what I started, one of the remarks that I made. This reform was done to fight political groups, economic groups. It was a fight between economic groups. They didn't think about society. They didn't pretend to change towards a digital democracy. That's not. The important thing is who holds the power. Is it me? Is it you? The people, they will remain the same. I don't see, and I would like to be optimistic, but I have to be realistic before you. I don't see a change in democracy. Yes, perhaps we will have more internet access. Perhaps the tariffs will be lower, but that is not equal to having rule of law, obviously, not having an equal access to justice, an equal access to information. So it's another point of view.
Professor Nolan?
Let me address, let me bring this a little bit down, but not too much, to the spectrum question. All right. I think just as you can never be too thin or have too many silk blouses, as it said, you can never have enough spectrum. So it is true that that if we say we'll double it and problems will go away, but of course like 12 minutes later, people will start broadcasting in high definition and receiving and multitasking and casting and so on. So I think this is part of the family of issues where the technology fix is not going to work beyond a certain short-term type transitional phase. So the wireless will always be the tail end, and that tail end will in fact become shorter and shorter, and fiber will migrate upper and upper. So the investment requirements are still going to be required. People's expectations will rise. People in metropolitan areas will have high quality video and internet of a speed that is gigabits in strength, and then to say to the rural areas, okay, you guys, you're going to get a little bit of lower quality wireless. It's going to work. At first, they will, of course, be grateful because they didn't have anything before, but 10 minutes later, they will say, what about why do we get a lower service level than the metropolitan areas? And we will be back at the same situation. So technology is not going to solve the problem. Now, just one more issue, namely, even in the provision of that, you will also encounter the same economies of scale and network effects that you have in other network type arrangements. And so therefore, even if the technology changes, you're still likely to see very high, very large market shares, very strong monopolistic or oligopolistic trends, which brings us back that the regulatory system is still going to be required in order to balance the pluralism and the access.
And Professor Knightley, you have the last question, the last word here.
Okay, maybe a comment on both things, rule of law and the spectrum. So a rule of law story from us. In 2010, we were the first residential super Wi-Fi deployment. We deployed a super Wi-Fi node in a home here in Houston, and it made the front page of the Houston Chronicle the day after we announced it. The very next day, I got a call from the chairman of the FCC's Commissioner on Electromagnetic Interference, and he asked me, did I have a license to transmit in what he just read about in the Houston Chronicle. So rule of law was strong. Fortunately, the answer was yes, I did have a license. So neither me nor my students went to jail for that transmission. The other thing to point out is, the other question about running out of spectrum. So it's certainly true there will always be a shortage. I think that one way it's rarely positioned is that there's a choice. So, for example, I mentioned how in Houston, 600 to 700 megahertz is used for over-the-air TV. Now, would you rather just turn that off and instead have 500 megabit per second Wi-Fi that goes from outdoors to indoors and so on? Most people would say, yeah, give me the internet everywhere, that always works, but it's never given to that end user as a choice, that we actually have choices in spectrum, but those are the real choices. The other thing is, when we do run out, there is the capability to go short range, because sometimes short range is better. I was talking about lower frequencies as the beachfront, but actually we spend about 80% of our download and upload bytes are done from indoors, and if it's done from in a room like this, there's really no need to beam it from outside. We can put a very high speed access point in here that's directional, and that's what's coming with the higher frequencies that are highly directional and gigabit per second. So this, the importance with spectrum is to wisely use what you have. If you need to go blast through a wall, you want that sub-gigahertz. If you're indoors and have a fiber, then by all means, use Wi-Fi and short range.
Well, again, thank you very much. I think we're out of time. I want to once again thank the Baker Institute Mexico Center and our 4 panelists. A round of applause, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to add my thanks and thank you for coming. As you can see, there's technical issues, there's democratic issues, political issues, regulatory issues, law and justice issues, and so on. We hope that this conversation we had today will derive into a larger research project, so stay tuned. Thank you again to all the panelists, and thank you for coming.